Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the ICT's premier podcast, Counter-Terrorism. Today, I'm Itai Handman, and as usual, we have a wonderful program scheduled for you today. We are going to be speaking about criminal finance, terror financing, how does money get laundered in the black market, how do illicit funds get transferred between groups, organizations, and eventually into the hands of terrorists and criminal organizations. To speak to us about this, we have a very special guest that I am quite honored to have on the program today, Mrs. Marie-Christine Dupuis-Danon. She's a subject matter expert of criminal finance, terrorism financing, money laundering, and the roads to better governance. She has worked as an investment banker advising many governments in the debt restructuring and management of their public finances throughout the 90s, before she joined the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, where she was coordinating the organization's technical assistance program to UN member states in the field of anti-money laundering policies in the early 2000s. As well, she has published and authored numerous books. We are so honored to have her on the program today. How are you doing today, Marie-Christine Dupuis-Danon?
Thanks, Itai, for the invitation. I'm very happy to join your podcast today.
Excellent. We're normally joined by real practitioners in the world of counterterrorism, and we never really get into the field of finance. So this is a very exciting opportunity for myself today to interview you, and I think it's a great opportunity for our audience and listeners to really learn a little bit about how the funding of terrorism, organized crime occurs around the world, because we live in a digital age now, and it should be much harder for them to be able to fund themselves. However, they seem to always have enough money when they need it for what they are up to. Before we get into the details of money laundering and finances, etc., I wanted to ask you to maybe give our audience a little bit of background about yourself. What made you interested in finance? What made you go down this road, eventually working at the UN and trying to track money laundering and illicit funding and all the hard work that you have put in over the years? What attracted you to this field? How did you get into it, and eventually to where you are today?
Well, that's a big question. I graduated from a business school, majoring in finance. So I have a financial background. While I was still studying, I had the opportunity to do an internship for a program for the World Bank. And then it appeared to me how powerful the geopolitics of money was. Some keynote professor came to the business school to deliver a presentation about the major transnational criminal organization. And he asked for someone to volunteer working in the financial dimension of it, because he had no such thing as a financial understanding of things. And in particular, we are at the beginning of the 90s, to try to understand why the discrepancy at the global level of the public finance was getting bigger and bigger, and how come the countries with the major abnormal issues were countries either involved in drug trafficking or offshore centers, offshore places. So I volunteered, and that's how I stepped into this very, very interesting and fascinating world. So at first, I tried to understand the creation of added value in drug trafficking at all stages, from the cultures to the street deals, especially for cocaine and heroin, which are interesting because you have to grow the plant. So there's a real industrial process to be conducted. And then from that, having assessed the amount of money, the amazing amount of money that was generated out of drug trafficking and other criminal activities, the challenge was to understand how it got landed in the global economy. And remember that in the 90s, we were at the very early stages of the understanding of how the flow of money was circulating and being able to be landed. in the financial sector and on trade-based activities and things like that. So with my financial background, I tried to bring something different, something, some kind of additional expertise to the expertise that field people from the law enforcement had. Obviously, people in the judiciary or people with the police or intelligence background had a grip of what's going on the field, but they had at this time a little understanding of how finance works. And as I was, as you said, I was also working in investment banking at the same time, advising less developed, highly indebted countries in their debt restructuring. It helped me understand how this global rate of finance was able to circulate in the international financial markets. And so that's about it. At the end of the 90s, the UN asked me if I would join, which I happily did. I was honored to have been proposed such an important role to go and advocate for anti-money laundering policy and to develop technical assistance programs for member states. Then 9/11 happened, and I got involved into counter-terrorism finance.
Very interesting. It's quite the journey to get from point A to point B that you have explained there, and quite interesting. And that now leads us to the questions at hand on your expertise. So in throughout your career and within your expertise, how would you say that terror organizations and criminal organizations fund themselves? What is the main method of funding? As we know, they can't just go get a 9-to-5 job and that's going to pay the bills for the terror organization. How do they make money?
Well, you would have to make a distinction between the terror organization and the transnational criminal organizations. So because your focus is on counterterrorism, I suggest that we start with the terror organization. And with that respect, there is a before and an after 9/11. After 9/11, there was this political decision to go after terror money and to extend all the anti-money laundering machinery that had been put in place during the course of the 90s, and that when 9/11 happened was pretty extended on a global basis, and to extend it to use it to trace and to combat terrorism financing. So there was first this idea that came up, and that was conceptually something very new. Before, you had to justify the origin of the funds to be able to prove that there were not proceeds of criminal activities, of illicit activities. After 9/11, not only the origin of the money, but the destination of the money had to be established. So you could have earned your money very legally. You were not able to use it to support or fund terrorist organization. That's a big thing. Second, because everything was in place for money laundering, so for proceeds of crime, to detect suspicious activity, to report on those suspicious transactions, to investigate them through the financial intelligence units, and then to go on the judiciary side of things, it became much more complicated for any type of organizations, but in particular for the terrorist organization, to just be supported by whoever individual or organization wanted to support a terrorist, extremist terrorist ideology. And then in the last 20 years, we see a common pattern in all terrorist organizations, which is to to be based on a territorial and opportunistic systematic exploitation of whatever they can lay their hand on. We've seen that with ISIS. It's probably going to be the case in Afghanistan. It's the case in sub-Saharan Africa. So you have a terrorist organization that takes control over a territory and that exploits everything that can be a source of money. They lay hand of spoils of war as they conquer the territory, and then they start exploiting the resources, the primary resources, mining, oil, precious minerals, poppy, to generate cash flow. And then they exploit the population. So they establish a very tight control that we could call extortion on the population, to impose taxes on every economic and social activity, to impose gateways on the roads, to extort funds wherever they can. And let's not forget that they also get involved in all kind of illicit trafficking, including trafficking in human beings, trafficking in organs, prostitution, so you name it. But
I just wanted to say, so you were saying they exploit natural resources and whatever is at hand there. Who's buying those natural resources or special minerals or whatever they have in the territory they have there? Because wouldn't that be illegal for a nation state to start purchasing oil or minerals or gold or diamonds, whatever they have in their territory, from a terrorist organization?
You're very right, but there are many intermediaries to be able to cut the traceability of things. So like each and every illicit trafficking, you find those gray zones and gray individuals that get involved as intermediaries in broking, acting as brokers for all those proceeds of resources that can be generated for somewhere. And let's not forget that very often this is happening in areas of the world which are subject to chaos, situation of chaos. So there are many facilitators that evolve in this environment, that swim into those pools and that are able to connect a need and a provider.
Very interesting.
At a cost. At a cost.
Of course. Everything at a cost, right? Very interesting. And so once these terror organizations do have the cash flow in their hands, and as we know, they don't just want to plan attacks in their neighborhood. As we understand, global jihadists, the reason they're called global is because they want to attack around the world. For that to happen, they need money. The cash flow, let's just say they have a hoard of cash in sub-Saharan Africa, but they want to plan an attack in Europe, so it costs money and funding, etc., etc. How do they launder the money that they now have in the cash that they have on hand to make it legal and then be able to transfer it to a cell or a group in Europe to be able to conduct an attack?
First, you have to distinguish two issues in terrorism financing. As you say, the attacks, the cost of the attacks, which is pretty low, even attacks perpetrated in Europe. To give you an indication, it's in the areas of some dozens of thousands of dollars or euros. Whereas the real cost is in financing the operations, the operational cost of the organization. So the fighters, the ammunitions, the equipment, being able to leave an army of hundreds of thousands of men on a daily basis. This is the real cost of it. So you would not necessarily have to launder the money, to transfer the money to finance some terrorist act in Europe. To exemplify, we have some pretty much detailed traceability of the funds that were needed to perpetrate the attacks that we had in France in 2015. So we had two waves of major attacks. One on January against a police officer in the street, and then a journalist that were doing caricatures and things like that, called Charlie Hebdo, and Hyper Cacher, Cacher supermarket in Paris. And the cost of those attacks amounted to 60 to 80 thousand euros. And then we had another series of attacks on the 13th of November 2015 in the Stade de France, which is the major soccer stadium in the north of Paris, on shootings at people that were having dinner on terrace in cafes in Paris, and during a rock concert in the Bataclan. Same, the amount of funds, $100,000 approximately. And they did not need to have money laundered for that. We have learned to use the financial intelligence to detect patterns and some just illegal criminal activities of trafficking counterfeited good, some consumption credit taken easily at a time. Now it's more complicated. The terrorists are using their saving accounts because they know that they're about to commit a suicide bombing attack, so they won't need their saving anymore. And that's about it. You don't need much more. So the real money is for entertaining the activities, the operational activities of the terrorist organization.
And that they can do with cash.
And that they are in countries where, first, as I said, it's zones of chaos, zones or areas where the weight of the informal economy is very prominent. So there are cash-based activities, and also now there are all the new opportunities of resorting to cyber assets, which are by essence totally dematerialized.
So does that mean they're getting into the cryptocurrency? Is that what you mean by cyber?
Yes, the crypto assets, cryptocurrencies, yes. Some intelligence report have established the fact that some terrorists could be rewarded for their action by Bitcoin key that are very easy to be sent.
So is it much harder to track terror financing in the digital age with cryptocurrency versus traditional banking methods?
It's certainly an upcoming challenge. At the same time, there is a traceability possibility in the blockchain, unlike everybody thinks. It's just that it takes a lot of time, but with the use of artificial intelligence, there is a kind of race ongoing at the moment between the new technologies that can be misused for financing terror and everything that the intelligence agency can develop using also the powerful input of artificial intelligence to trace, for instance, some intelligence agencies are able to trace or pretend that they're able to trace bitcoins related to terror financing.
Very interesting. It's a real black hole to me as I'm trying to understand how the cryptocurrency world works and blockchain and how terrorists are able to utilize it. But that's why we have you on the program today to help us understand these very difficult subject matters. Could you explain to us a little bit, what do terror organizations or criminal organizations do specifically to circumvent financial law, international financial law? Because that's one of the most interesting of the international law that we have out there. It's probably one of the most sophisticated out there, as we have seen criminal international law really lag behind nation states, lag behind the times. But in this global marketplace, financial laws have really been placed at a high premium and at a high priority, and we see quite a bit of them. So how are these groups able to circumvent these international financial laws?
That's a big question. First, you have to understand the financial power of criminal organizations. They have been able to expand their activities. The globalization after the fall of the Berlin Wall offered tremendous opportunities for major transnational criminal organizations to expand their activities globally. And they've been able to make up fortunes that go beyond imagination. So when you're that rich, you can afford the best advisors on the legal aspects, on the financial aspects, so that they are always on edge to be aware of each and every loophole, each and every opportunity. Jurisdictions, you're very right. The legal and regulatory framework has been expanded tremendously, but some jurisdictions, because they are less equipped or because they are less motivated, do not apply these AML, CFT frameworks with the same strength and the same drive. So when you are able to pay a premium for the money to be laundered by super experts, there are still opportunities to do so. You have to understand that from the head of a criminal activity or criminal person, they're always making arbitrages. So it's all a question of arbitrage, like very often in finance. And the arbitrages between the risk, which are twofold. You don't want your money to be identified and confiscated, and you don't want some law enforcement to trace the activity back to you. So a head of a criminal organization will be very much unlikely to be traced until him, because he has so many straw men to cut the trace and so many legal structures to harbor the activities, that it makes the whole thing of going after the money very, very complicated. So those are the risks. And on the other hand, the price that you are willing to pay to make your money laundering thing efficient and secure. If you're not paying much, the risk of losing the money or being caught will be much higher than if you are willing to invest a lot of money to multiply the jurisdictions, to multiply the circulation of money, to multiply the use of legal vehicles that cut the trace. And plus, because it's been going on for a couple of decades now, all those criminal organizations have started to invest in the legal economy. And that's another issue. Investing in a legal business and having some part of the activity which is legal and part of the activity which is used as the logistical support, either for trafficking or for laundering money, is your very best option, because it's very difficult to sort things apart. For instance, in export-import activities, so trade-based money laundering is very difficult to identify. All the activities in the tourism sectors or real estate are difficult to go after.
Very interesting. Very interesting. They seem to find all the loopholes. And like you said, it's a matter of being very wealthy and rich that they're able to hire the very best advisors to help them. But if we could try to simplify this for the audience, just to understand a little clearer. Hypothetically, I own a business and import-export business, and it's doing rather well. Everything is on the up and up. It's very legal. There's no illicit activity, anything like that. But I'm starting to struggle maybe my business financially a little bit, and someone steps in with an offer of investment in my company. You check the person out, like you said, there's probably multiple straw men between one person and the head of an organization. So I meet said straw man, and he says, I would like to invest X amount of money into your company, help you out for percentage ownership of your company. I agree, there doesn't seem to be any problems. But at a certain point, law enforcement is able to come in and say, that person that offered you money works for the head of this organization and blah, blah, blah. Does that make my business now illegal? Do the funds that I have in my business now, are they considered illicit? Is my business now under investigation?
There's a protection of bona fide, so good faith third party in most countries. So if you're the victim of some misuse of a business transaction or a business investment, then you should be protected. But you're right, there are some entrepreneurs that have found themselves in terrible situations because they were totally unaware that the investment proposed that came to them was not as as much of a good idea as it originally seemed. And that's how the diligence for accepting foreign investment comes into place. There's some diligence to be made, and then it's up to each and every company to do so. For big companies, major companies, they have the appropriate people to check on the background of providential funders or investors.
Very interesting. So what type of role does the UN or the IMF or nation states play in trying to stop the flow of illicit funds? Do they need to work together? Is there a very individualistic approach here? Because one thing that we have seen in the world of terrorism specifically is the battle of jurisdiction and the no talking between intelligence agencies. That's something that's happened over the last decade. We've seen a lot more cooperation between intelligence agencies, militaries, etc., in trying to capture terrorists. But as we know through commissions and whatnot, if we speak about 9/11, there was no communication between the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI, hence the creation of Homeland Security Department to coordinate all these intelligence agencies. Is there a big problem when it comes to international finance trying to stop illicit funding from a jurisdictional point of view? Who takes the lead? Is that a nation state? Is it the UN? Is it the IMF?
Fortunately, the culture of those financial or UN organizations is different from the one of the intelligence. The relationship to sharing some information. Information is power in the world of intelligence. So that's very specific, and we can get back to that later if you wish. For as far as AML, anti-money laundering, and combating the financing of terrorism is concerned, you have the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, that is leading in the establishing of the legal and regulatory framework. So they enacted 40 recommendations and plus 8 special recommendations pertaining to the financing of terrorism. And that is used as the framework, the global framework to review how the jurisdictions are compliant with that. The underlying legal instruments are universal instruments that are developed under the auspices of the United Nations. You can also find some regional based conventions, but you have universal instruments. For the financing of terrorism, it's the 1999 UN Convention to combat the financing of terrorism. For organized crime, it's the Palermo Convention against transnational organized crime. That was open to the signature of nation states in 2000. So you have those global instruments, and for most of them, what they do is to define what is the offense, the criminal offense, how it should be penalized, and how the international cooperation in matters of judiciary procedures will be organized. And that's very, very important to have those universal instruments, because you have to deal with different type of law, Roman law, common law, which do not interact very well. So you do need a common basis to be able to work on that. So the UN level or universal legal instruments, the conventions, and then the legal and regulatory framework at the global level with the FATF, and the checking on the compliance of how this is being applied by the jurisdictions is done jointly by the IMF, the FATF. They conduct assessment on how compliant the jurisdictions are with this machinery.
So one thing that we have noticed in researching terrorist organizations, definitely at the ICT, and something that I have worked on personally as well, we have seen slowly over the last decade and a half, approximately, a real coordination between organized transnational organized crime units or groups and terrorist organizations. We know that international, transnational cartels and organized crime groups have trafficked in all kinds of illicit activities. As you mentioned earlier, human trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, black market art sales, etc., whatever it is, organized crime has had a hand in it for many, many years. We can go back to prohibition days in the 1920s and how organized crime flooded the United States with alcohol, for example, tobacco, etc. Why we saw the ATF be created, the Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms branch of the FBI. And now we're seeing terror groups work hand in hand with them. And it's something that's very interesting. I mean, we can take a step back and look at Southern America and the cocaine industry specifically, and how Pablo Escobar at one point was the 6th richest person in the world just on his distribution of cocaine. And he used many, many terror tactics to have his organization be what it was, by killing political enemies, killing politicians, anyone that tried to put a law in place, specifically extradition to the United States, became an enemy. So through the years, we see a natural partnership needing to be developed. And when we research terror groups in the modern times of now, the last decade and a bit, we see that they are heavily involved in drugs. We know that in the Middle East here, in Syria and in Lebanon, Captagon is being developed by Hezbollah specifically, and they are selling it to the world. We know that certain terror groups here in the Middle East are working with cartels in Mexico and in Southern America in the drug trade, but also on learning how to build tunnels, which is something that's very interesting that I have noticed in coordination with one another. Cartels in Mexico and organizations in the Middle East are teaching one another how to dig tunnels to get into the United States from the southern border there, or, for example, here to infiltrate Israel from the north or the south. Um, so my question to you is, what type of cooperation are we seeing on the financial end between terrorist organizations and criminal organizations? Does one have the edge over the other? Does one need the other more than the other, for example? When thinking about it, does or a transnational organization, a criminal organization, need the terrorist, or does the terrorist need the transnational organization?
I would not phrase it like that in terms of need, but rather in terms of opportunities to be more efficient on both sides, or to share some know-how. So you always have to keep in mind that those organizations, they're targeting maximum efficiency, maximum creation of added value of money, and they're playing in some cases on the same play field. So in some cases, it's more cooperative than in others. Sometimes it's like competition and cooperation at the same time. And in some of these areas, like in the sub-Saharan strip, sub-Saharan strip in sub-Saharan Africa, those are more or less, the lines are blurred between the actors. There had been trafficking in this part of the Sahara Desert for centuries, and it also now serves as harbors to some of the terror organizations that keep crossing borders in between a number of countries in the region. So naturally, there are cousins, there are ethnic-based link, and there are some opportunity deals that are put in place. In other cases, when it's purely criminal trafficking activities versus terror activities, it can be sort of a problem when it highlights too much on an area and it starts being something that puts pressure on the trafficking. For instance, in Belgium, a lot of the terrorists from the attack of the 13th of November 2015 came from an area near Brussels called Molenbeek. It is one of those gray zones where there's a lot of drug trafficking going on. And obviously, one of the terrorists, the only survivor of the attack, finds some harbor there for a couple of months. Everybody was looking for him everywhere and he was back home. But intelligence also showed that the normal flow of drug trafficking got disturbed by too much attention on this area, and it started irritating some of the major players there. So it's okay to cooperate and to have those exchange of best practices as long as it does not disturb the regular traffics and the money that it generates. Because for a criminal organization, money will always be ranked first in terms of priority.
Very interesting. So willing to cooperate with one another if it helps one another until you infringe on my financial gain is basically what I've understood there.
That's a pretty, yes, it's a good way to summarize that.
So in that sense, would they stop cooperating at that point? Do they turn on each other? What happens in that type of a scenario, like you just explained, where the organized criminal group is sitting there saying, we worked with this said terrorist, for example, or this group, and now they're bringing way too much attention onto our organization and our finances, and they're disrupting our drug trafficking or arms trafficking, whatever it is, and we're losing money. At that point, what options do they have, or what do they do?
In that case, is Salah Abdeslam, the terrorist, was identified and located. So law enforcement went after him, and then he was extracted. He's in jail. The lawsuit is starting as I'm speaking to you. In other areas or regions of the world, it's much more blurred, because, as I said, you will find typically those actors taking as many as they can from failed states, from chaos zones, from areas where there was no law enforcement, and so it's difficult to sort out in those places. I think we have to rely a lot on intelligence. And the intelligence sources that help identify who are the main money facilitators, who are the key people that are doing some intermediations in business, that are carrying the suitcases of banknotes, that are connected to the right banks that have a lower level of compliance, and that are able to inject the money into the international financial system. This is a lot of intelligence-based work that needs to be done to be able to identify the key players and the people that is really important to go after.
Fair enough. And I know we've kept you for quite some time on this interview. So one last major question for you before we let you go. And something that sort of came to me when I'm trying to do research and understand a little bit more about this subject, so we can have a more intelligent conversation here, and I'm not so in the dark about the subject matter, was obviously I read about the Panama Papers and the situation of what happened there and illicit banking that went on in that area. And it brought me to a very, I guess, peculiar question. Is there, in this day and age right now, a central hub, another Panama, if you will, where terrorists and criminals are using it specifically for hiding their finances? Because in this globalized world today, the world has shrunk significantly. There is much less place, very little place to hide anymore on the planet. And then when it comes to the world of finance, it's even smaller, specifically because of the digital capacity that we have now. Someone can transfer money from Siberia to the depths of Antarctica without any issue. And so when you sit there and try to understand and realize how small the global financial world really became due to the digitization of everything, is there still now, or was there, continues, will there be a central hub, if you will, or multiple central hubs where terrorists and criminal organizations say, okay, you know what, Panama got raided and we lost that. Let's move to Hong Kong or Singapore or somewhere in Zimbabwe. I don't know. I'm just throwing stuff out there. I used Hong Kong as a financial center of the world because it really is a major finance center of the world. But are there places, or is there one central hub that law enforcement needs to sort of zero in on and say, what's going on there is something we need to investigate much further?
It should not be. In an ideal world, with all the legal framework in place and implemented, in theory, it should not have happened in Panama. That was one of the jurisdictions that had to pass and implement anti-money laundering legislation. But we are not living in an ideal world. We are living in a world of complexity. So maybe it has shrinked, but it also gone more complex. And the issue is, as I said, you have the legislations on paper, and you have different levels in the commitment for implementing the legislation. And you have that at the government level, all the regulatory authorities, the central bank and other regulatory bodies for specific fields of the economic activities, real estate, precious metals, you name them. And so this has to be implemented at all those levels, and it's not, obviously, it's not. So when there are some assessment missions that come and visit the jurisdictions, the teams try to make an as accurate assessment of the reality of the situation as they can, but the issues pertaining to finding the real identity of the beneficial owners of a business, of a legal vehicle to harbor funds, trust, or other types of legal vehicles, is it's difficult. You cannot investigate as you would if there was a case opened for each and every of those dozens of thousands of legal vehicles that you have on paper. So that's how there are still places with a weaker level of compliance on the lower level of implementation. The FATF tries to monitor that. Plus, I would say there's something that is difficult happening at the moment. During the 90s, the course of the 90s, maybe the first half until 2010, there was people and countries were working to build something of an enhanced global governance. And then in this phase of our centuries, we've seen major players coming on front of the stage that do not play the global governance with the same rules. Some countries like China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, they have their own agenda. So my guess is that it's going to be more and more difficult to build something common in terms of financial governance, because you will have nations with different agendas. And after a phase of converging towards building something that is going to be sustainable on a global level, we see now some major actors, and it has financial implications, especially with China, some major players that come up with their own agenda. But it's fascinating, and we will keep observing all those emerging trends.
Most definitely, it is extremely fascinating, and this conversation has been extremely interesting and sobering. Before we let you go, I wanted to give you the opportunity to let our audience know where they can find some of your wonderful books, where they can find some of the work that you do, because I have no doubt that a bunch of our audience is going to be racing to the Google to look you up and find some of your work. So where would be the best place for them to find some of that wonderful work?
If they Google me, they will be able to find the books. You can buy them on every platform like Amazon, but I don't want to advertise a specific one. I'm sure they will find when there's a will, there's a way, as you say. And unfortunately, it's still for French-speaking people, because it has not been much translated into English. But,
well, we're lucky that's still a very global language, and so many people will be able to still read it and find the wonderful books that you have written. For any audience member that has joined us late in the program, we have had the honor of having Marie-Christine Dupuis-Danon as a subject matter expert on the program today. She is an expert in criminal finance, terror financing, money laundering, and the roads to better governance. as we spoke about. She was an investment banker in the 90s, advising governments in debt restructuring and management of their public financing, joined the UN in the early 2000s, late 90s, to work with the UN Office on Drug and Crime, and as well as we just mentioned, an author of numerous books. It has been a pleasure to have you on the program today. It was a real sobering and informative conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join our program today. Thank you.
Thank you again, Itai. Thank you for the invitation.